Good morning. Welcome to the International Connection. Today is show number 44 in the radio series on mind control, and today we are bringing you part one of an interview with Gail Fisher-Taylor, a psychotherapist working with survivors of trauma. And we're going to talk about the nature of memory, and particularly traumatic memory. This will be the final interview in this radio series, Mind Control in Canada and the U.S. And to end off the series, we're going to have a panel discussion on February 22nd about ritual abuse and healing for survivors with Elise Murphy, Karen Stardancer, and Gail Fisher-Taylor. Then on March 1st, a panel about government military mind control with Walter Boer. And now the interview with Gail Fisher-Taylor. I'm here speaking with Gail Fisher-Taylor, a psychotherapist who works with abuse survivors. Welcome to the show, Gail.
Okay, thank you.
And I'd like to start off with asking you, what is the current work that you're doing?
Well, I'm a psychotherapist, a consultant, and I also do training and education, particularly around trauma. And I work with people who basically want change in their lives, or they want to change something about their lives. So I work with a whole range of issues that people have, but I definitely specialize in the area of trauma. And that includes adult survivors of childhood sexual abuse, and of various kinds of sadistic abuse, and some who have been survivors of mind control.
Right. And throughout this radio series, I mean, the term ritual abuse has come up both within a cult setting and within a government mind control context. And I know with talking with you previously that you've had some trouble with that term, ritual abuse. How do you feel about how that's being used currently?
Okay, well, let me talk a little bit about the trouble I have with the term. Okay, I think it emphasizes the wrong thing. It emphasizes ritual, and what we're really talking about here is we're talking about criminal activity. We're talking about things like sexual abuse, like confinement, forms of mind control. We're talking about child pornography rings. We're talking about child prostitution rings, as well as adult pornography and prostitution rings. We're also talking about rituals that involve criminal activity, such as murder and torture. So I think what needs to be emphasized in the abuse is that it's criminal activity, often done by multi-perpetrators. They're often multi-victims in the crimes. It's in many times it's cult. It's cult activity, much of which is illegal. And I think that the term ritual abuse, emphasizing the belief system is part of it. But I think, and it's easy for the media and for other people to sensationalize that aspect of things. I think that sadistic cult abuse is a good term. But it's not totally comprehensive either. I think we have a problem with language here, really defining what we're talking about and being really emphasizing the correct things. Also, in terms of this kind of abuse, just like to point out that what's involved in it is basically they're crimes against humanity. They're the kinds of crimes that we see in wars. They're the kinds of crimes that we know exist. And I think that when the ritual aspects are emphasized and sensationalized, as they are in the media, that it distances people from the reality of what's really going on.
Mm-hmm. And so you would more prefer to be more specific about what is actually involved in a particular case, whether it does involve child prostitution, pornography, or whatever kinds of criminal activities in terms of the context that abuse is taking place in?
Well, what I like to do is I like to try to talk about these kinds of abuse that a lot of people want to distance themselves from and want to disbelieve because they're so horrific. I think if we ground them, our discussions, in events and incidences that we know exist, that what we start doing is that we start making it more difficult for people just to concentrate on the sensationalist aspects of the crimes, basically. And what we need to do is we both need to relate this kind of abuse to what people know exists in our society, and we also need to relate it to what everyone can relate to. So I look at a lot of things on a continuum, and this kind of abuse is very much on a continuum. It's not separate from all other kind of abuse. It's very much related to a lot of phenomena that many people have some sort of experience with, and we all have experience with by just watching TV and are involved. Yeah, reading a newspaper.
Right. Yeah, and I think people, in particular the media, tend to, when they hear that term ritual abuse, tend to automatically think it's a satanic ritual abuse and involves some kind of satanic cults, and which does exist out there, but a lot of people do have a hard time believing that goes on. And that really, as you mentioned, it takes away from the actual criminal activities that are happening, whether it's in the context of that kind of belief system or not.
That's true, and I think there's another point here too, is that all repeated abuse is basically ritualized, and what I mean by that is that, for instance, if somebody is a serial killer, is they develop patterns of behavior so that when a serial killer murders a number of different people, the police are able to at least speculate that it's the same murderer because there are patterns within the way that murder is done. If somebody sexually abuses children, a pedophile, there are often ritualized aspects to the way that they sexually abuse children. And what it relates to probably is the traumatic reenactment of the actual perpetrator who's committing those crimes. In other words, what I'm saying here is that when somebody's been traumatized as a child and hasn't resolved that trauma, not everybody does this. There are lots of people who've been traumatized who don't reenact that on other people, but there are also a proportion of people who've been traumatized who then go on to commit the same crimes against other people later on in their lives.
Now, I'd like to talk about the process of processing experience into memory, because, as you know, there's a big debate going on in public about so-called recovered memories, which are linked to traumatic experience. And I wonder if you could talk just a bit about how the human mind does process experience.
Okay, well, I'd like to start by talking a little bit about one way that we think, which is associatively. And what I mean by that is that if, let's say, we're walking along the street and it starts to snow and the snowflakes are really large flakes, and we had an experience, let's say, a long time ago or maybe even recently, we might start to get feelings that we had in that experience. Let's say that we start remembering building a snow fort when we were a child, and that what happens is that all of those feelings, let's say it was a wonderful experience, all those feelings may start to come back just by the fact that we see these large snowflakes that remind us of an experience, a previous experience. We may start to get all kinds of sensory input from that previous time. We might start to, even though the air might be different in the present, we might remember what the air was like at that particular time. We might smell certain smells that aren't there in the present, but that were there at that particular time. We might hear sounds that aren't there in the present, that were there at that particular time. And then what happens is that that we remember in all kinds of ways, and we encode our experience in all kinds of ways. And there's an implicit kind of remembering, which is basically sensory motor experiences. There's emotional experience that we remember, And then there's the explicit, which is more a narrative kind of remembering.
We're telling a story about what happened.
That's right, sequential, and the explicit is actually a less reliable kind of remembering. We can get the details wrong. We can get the sequences wrong. Mm-hmm. The implicit, we might get confused because we have to interpret that explicitly. But that those body sensations, those sensory sensations, those emotions will relate we know that they're from somewhere. We might get mixed up about what they relate to, but we know that they relate to a specific event or specific events in our lives.
Mm-hmm. So how does traumatic experience affect that process of association?
Well, it affects it in a number of ways. It depends upon the traumatic experience, and it depends upon the emotional significance of the traumatic experience, and it also depends upon whether it's repeated traumatic experience or a one-time traumatic experience. Clinically, what we start to see is that that trauma creates blocks, that it can keep a person in certain areas of his or her life sort of locked into certain belief systems, certain ways of interpreting things. What it can also do is that the associations are fragmented. In other words, what I mean is that if we remember in all of these different ways, and that experience is encoded, in a sensory motor way and emotionally and in all of the senses, so that we hear certain sounds and we smell certain smells and taste certain tastes, that this is also in a non-traumatic experience, we would relate that to the narrative. We would have an idea about a wholeness of the event. What can happen in trauma, especially if it's repeated trauma or really profound trauma, is that this gets fragmented. And it's really a protective device, that if something terrible is happening that the individual has a hard time coping with, is that their actual internal, they're called opioids, which are chemicals inside our bodies that are like opium and create an effect that's similar to opium and are related to the shock that people go into, let's say, in an automobile accident or in other traumas. And they slow down the body, and it seems that with other kinds of neurochemicals in our nervous system, that what happens is that there's a fragmentation that occurs, so that we may have a recollection. There may be a lot of terror involved in a particular traumatic event, but we may block out completely what that terror is related to. So, for instance, I think that psychiatrist Bessel van der Kolk gave a really excellent example about how it all works and how it can be different for different people. He was giving a talk, and he was saying, now, if I suddenly exploded here, he said, most of you in the audience would have what he calls a flashbulb memory. In other words, a very vivid memory, an enhanced memory for the rest of our lives of that event occurring. But he also had with him a colleague who knew him very well and who I imagine he was fairly close with. And he said, now to my colleague, probably what would happen is that she would have a very vague memory if she had any memory at all. And that would be because of the emotional significance of the event to her, that it would be very different to someone who knew him directly. It would be much more traumatic for her than it would be for those of us in the audience who didn't have an emotional relationship with him. And I think this is really significant in terms of children and adult survivors who as children have been abused by particularly a parent or some other person who has a strong relationship with them. So if a child is let's say, sexually abused by a father or a mother, because we're finding more and more that there is abuse by women, and if that child is dependent on that individual for survival, there's a real dilemma for that child, because I'll just say she, but it happens to he's lots too, she will need to remain attached to that individual for survival, and yet the fact that this person who might be reading her bedtime stories is then sexually abusing her later on is extraordinarily confusing, and there's tremendous amount of betrayal involved there. And so one thing that we see clinically is that these are the kinds of traumatic experiences that get dissociated quite frequently. And it's the element of betrayal that is often a very important factor in how much somebody will or will not remember about a particular, let's say, sexual abuse or other kinds of abuse by a parent.
So what is your understanding of the phenomena of dissociation and the different levels of dissociation that can happen? You brought up betrayal as a significant factor, and perhaps repeated extreme forms of trauma. But can you talk about what, in terms of the victim's point of view, what's going on there?
Okay, well, let me start first with dissociation, because again, I think very much on a continuum, and that everybody dissociates to a certain extent. I mean, if somebody's reading a book or, playing an instrument, doing artwork, there's often a fair bit of dissociation involved in those activities. And what that is it's a form of hyperconcentration. And in that hyperconcentration, there's a splitting off and splitting away from other things that are going on, let's say, in the environment. What also happens, and everybody has ego states, which are basically parts of ourselves that take on different roles and that feel different ways. So we all have child ego states that are there from childhood and who have certain experiences, and that those experiences remain in that kind of age within us. So, for instance, when someone who, let's say, hasn't been traumatized at all is in a particular situation, and let's say a particular ego state has had some injustice in his life, that what may happen is, in another situation in the present day, that child ego state may be basically triggered to come out and maybe reacts in a very strong way to an injustice in 1997. Now, what happens is when somebody's been traumatized is that the splits between the ego states become much more distinct, and that what happens is that they become the dissociation in the way that somebody can split off and maybe not be as conscious of not just things in the external environment, but other kinds of things inside that person. I mean, we all have places in ourselves where we aren't aware of. We have times when we're not aware of, why, when we say, "Oh, I'm not going to do that ever again," and then suddenly we find ourselves doing that right away. The way that I explain that is that basically one ego state says, "I'm never going to do it again," and out pops another one who says, "Oh, you aren't? I'm going to do it right now." And so it's a phenomenon that occurs in everybody.
But is this happening more on a subconscious level?
Yeah, it would be happening on a subconscious level or an unconscious level. Mm-hmm. But what happens when somebody's traumatized is that these ego states become more and more distinctive and more operative as distinctive personalities, basically, or identities.
On a conscious level?
What happens is that sometimes the person is totally not conscious that this is going on. I mean, the extreme of this would be when somebody has what used to be called multiple personality, which is now called a dissociative identity, and in the medical field, disorder, what happens is that person may not be aware that there are these different identities that are coming out and acting in certain ways and dressing in certain ways, and there's a kind of sensation that somehow time has jumped ahead, or that there's a confusion about what day it is. Now, the way that works in trauma is that someone will, when somebody's traumatized, that there'll be an ego state or an identity that will come forward and handle certain aspects of that trauma. And during one particular trauma, let's say that the person is being abused in some kind of way, there might even be a number of different identities that come out and handle different aspects of the abuse. And that it's, again, a very important protective mechanism when this is happening, so that the person is not having to handle everything and be totally overwhelmed. There's a fragmentation of experience in the different identities, so that one identity might be handling, let's say that there's a demand to act like that identity is enjoying the sexual abuse. So there might be one identity who comes out and who actually learns to enjoy the sexual abuse. And then there might be another identity that's in a rage about the sexual abuse and holds the rage. And that those two identities don't have any co-consciousness with each other. They don't know that each other exists, and they don't know that the feelings that the other one has are there. And so it would work like that. There might be another part that feels very vulnerable and wants to cry during it. And that, again, there wouldn't be the co-consciousness with the other identity.
I guess the difference I was trying to get at with the normal ego states that we all have on a subconscious level don't ever really come out to the forefront in usually, whereas in people with, on the extreme end of that, dissociative identity disorder, can have different identities come out to the forefront where they take on the voice and the mannerisms of a child and so forth.
Yeah, well, I think in a way it's not so clear-cut as that. I mean, I think certainly with somebody who has dissociative identity, that there are very noticeable changes, and that with somebody who just has normal ego states that aren't so distinctive, if you start understanding ego states, you can start identifying that a particular ego state is there. They might not have exactly that childlike voice in an as extreme a way, but what they may have is that they may be saying things that make sense in a 3-year-old context, from a 3-year-old's point of view, but don't make sense in that adult's point of view. And that when somebody is sounding that way, what's really happening is that there's another ego state there that's operating at a different stage of development. And when you start to understand these mechanisms, you start to see them, and they do come into the forefront. It's just they're more subtle than with somebody who has dissociative identity.
So from what I'm hearing, in terms of just ego states in people that have not had a traumatic history or been severely traumatized, that there is a certain amount of communication going on there between the ego states. But what accounts for then the amnesia between identities, or the non-communication or non-awareness of the other identities within somebody that is dissociative?
Okay, well, I'm not sure I can answer what accounts for it. We can guess at it, and we can basically say that, I mean, one of the determining factors for the diagnosis of dissociative identity disorder, as it's called, is that somebody has to be amnestic. In other words, they have to have amnesia for certain blocks of time. And what, from my experience and from those of us who are working in this field, I think would agree with this, is that the amnesia and particularly survivors would probably agree with this, that the amnesia really does protect in lots of ways. And so somehow it seems to be this survival mechanism and this protective mechanism that allows the fragmentation of experience to happen so that the individual isn't overwhelmed right in the midst of it, nor is the individual overwhelmed when these memories may be coming back, or the ego states or the identities start getting together and start giving some of this experience, the knowledge of this experience.
So really the name or the term disorder is really a misnomer. It seems to be a defense mechanism, a natural.
I think it is. I think a better word would be dynamic, because I think it is
strategy.
Yeah, it's a very dynamic coping strategy, and I think that sure it can be maladaptive in adulthood and can cause problems, but that in a lot of ways what it does in the midst of the trauma is it can allow someone to survive who might not otherwise survive.
Now, with people that have been severely traumatized and are dissociative, I understand that there isn't that kind of move between implicit memory and explicit. There isn't somehow a processing of that experience fully that they can in their conscious state or their main persona, that they can't narratively tell what happened in an abusive situation before. And why is that? Why isn't that implicit memory processed? Okay, well there are basically some theories about this. And there's research that's backing some of these theories, or seems to be backing some of these theories. It seems that what is happening in trauma, when somebody's being traumatized, is that in the limbic system in our brain, that the amygdala, which basically gives emotional significance to things, or at least that's the theory, is very, very key in traumatic experience, and that implicit memory, that is again sensory, motor, and emotional, will be there. That the person may feel terror in this particular circumstance, but that what happens is that it seems that the hippocampus is bypassed, or at least that's the hypothesis, and that the hippocampus is what is needed to give order to things and to create a narrative and to create the associations. Well, I mean, there are going to be associations without the hippocampus. Now, I'm oversimplifying here, but it seems that what happens in that overwhelming trauma is that there's that the people often do not remember the specific narrative. In other words, let's say that someone's mugged. Let's just go with something like this, as simple as this. What they may remember of that event is not the face. They may not be able to sort of give a narrative of. They may not have been looking at the face. They may be able to remember what the weapon looked like. Let's say that they were being mugged with a gun. They may be able to remember. They certainly will be able to remember the terror that they felt. They may not be able to remember all the events around it. That may be completely dissociated away. Or if it wasn't that terrifying, it seems to have to do with the adrenaline level. That when the adrenaline is at a certain level, that the memory will be, as Bessel van der Kolk talks about, a flashbulb memory. In other words, it will be remembered very vividly. But it's almost when the adrenaline level gets too high that what happens is that the memory will get vague. Or there'll be that fragmentation involved where somebody knows that something terrifying happened. They may know something of the event, or they may know nothing of the event, particularly if it's repeated trauma, that it gets dissociated away. there seems to be a lot of confusion in the debate about recovered memories of the nature and the difference of traumatic memory versus memory that can be recalled in a narrative way. And I guess we've been talking about some of the factors that why that happens, and I guess the physical and physiological workings of the brain not being able to process that through the hippocampus, or the hippocampus being overwhelmed by the experience and not being able to take in that and to give sense to it.
And one thing that's very interesting is that some of the research has demonstrated that in Vietnam veterans, for instance, they have smaller hippocampuses, which doesn't prove this theory, but it supports the theory. And so I think what's significant here is that, and what's really important in the debate about recovered memory, is that there are a number of factors actually. One is that that traumatic memory seems to be quite different from normal, common, ordinary memory. And there's that difference between, as Bessel van der Kolk talks about, implicit memory and explicit memory. And that, so that somebody can, I believe that people are remembering their traumas in certain ways probably almost every second of their lives, that they're reliving it emotionally. Their beliefs have been affected by them. They may feel, if they've been abused a lot, they may feel totally worthless, and that comes out of how they've been treated as a child in let's say the abuse, and that's being relived all the time. The terror may be relived practically every second of their lives, and in some ways, all that has to happen is the various fragments have to come together, and the awareness has to be connected. That, let's say they're having particular recurring dreams that have particular images that actually relate to traumatic experience when they were a child, and let's say that they have certain fantasies that they don't know why they have these fantasies, and let's say that they're feeling a high level of panic or fear or grief or rage that's related to what happened to them. What has to happen is that they have to understand, or they have to somehow be able to connect all of these implicit kind of experiences with the explicit knowledge of what it's connected to. Now, the fact that we have to interpret implicit experience with explicit knowledge can get problematic, because our narrative kind of memories are not that accurate in certain ways. For instance, we've got, the example I like to use is you have 10 people witness a car accident. Now, everybody knows that a car accident happened, but they may have 10 completely different versions of how it happened and who was at fault and what the sequence of events was. But what will happen is that, so there are inaccuracies in explicit memory, and there are confusions in explicit memory, and there can be misinterpretations because we have to use explicit means to interpret the implicit information. And that can be difficult, but I think that it's important to try to make those connections, and it also has to do with making the connections between the right and left brain. That more intuitive, sensory, emotional experience has to be, in trauma, it has to be reunited with verbal processing and understanding belief systems that have come out of the beliefs that have come out of traumatic experience.
So, even though that somebody may be living with the implicit memories of a traumatic experience that happened, even decades before, throughout the series I've been talking to the more extreme forms of trauma in terms of government mind control, which is very systematic and repeated, and often that people will be amnesic in terms of being able to say, well, I was involved in these experiments, but at some point in their lives, something triggers this memory back, and they're able to put, I guess, the pieces of the implicit memory back together. And I wonder if you could talk about that process of remembering things that had happened decades before.
Okay, well, let's talk. I think what we need to talk about first is triggering, which is basically very much related to the associations we make. Let's say that someone was abused in a room of a particular color, let's say in a blue room, and the blue is a particular shade of blue. What may happen is every time they walk into a room or every time they see that color, let's say on somebody's clothing, they might start feeling sick. They might start feeling in a rage. They might start having all kinds of reactions that they don't understand if the explicit memory of that event has been dissociated. But basically what they're doing is that they're getting certain kinds of implicit memory back in relation to that traumatic event. They just have a fragmentation that occurred, so that they don't know what it actually relates to. And in fact, what they may do is that they may then think that it relates to something in the present. So they may start trying to find an explanation in the present day for all of those intense feelings that have just been triggered off. In other words, have been associated with that color blue. So what happens is that it's kind of a process where the amnestic barriers are starting to come down, and or the dissociative barriers, you could say too, are starting to not be so strong, and that there's more co-consciousness among states, because when dissociation happens, there will be states that know that what happened. And in a way, Colin Ross talks about the fact that, it's not really recovered memory because some part of the individual has retained that memory all along, which is very interesting. That what happens is that identity may not have let that information become co-conscious with other identities within the community of identities inside one person. But what starts to happen is as the person is involved in some sort of life circumstance, or often when they're in psychotherapy, that there's more of an awareness of what's going on internally. That's part of what psychotherapy is about. It's to look at what is going on inside and what prevents the kind of changes that people want to make, and then how do you work towards making those changes so that their lives can become better. So what then starts to happen is that once these associations get recognized, and once somebody starts to understand the ways these mechanisms are working inside himself or herself, that it can actually be an opening for developing more and more awareness, and give some of those identities or ego states, because not everybody who has had traumatic experience has dissociative identity. A lot of people have a kind of dissociation where they have very active ego states that are holding these kinds of experiences inside them, but they're not operating as what we used to call multiples, right? So that when the recollection process starts, it's really a process of increased awareness. There's a connecting so that there's less fragmentation among things like, what the sensory experiences are and what the emotional experiences are, and the explicit knowledge of the experiences. So, in other words, if these experiences are related to a particular kind of abuse or a particular abusive experience, that memory starts to come back. Now, as I say, we can misremember something that happened last week, we get the general gist of something that happened, but we can get the details wrong. So we have to be very careful with how we do that recollection process, and there's certain aspects of the recollecting that we can have a very strong feeling that yes, that's right, and aspects of it, I think that because of the implicit information, we can have an inner knowing that yes, this really did happen in this way.
Right.
If you know the smell of your father, right, and that smell was in the room when the abuse was happening, you can be pretty certain that that's who it was. Or if you have a flashbulb memory of his face, you can probably pretty accurately, explicitly interpret that. But there are other aspects that can get confused in that explicit interpretation of the implicit information.
Now, how does abreaction play a part in that, in terms of remembering and making sense of the implicit memory, and how does that or how is that related to having flashbacks, like in terms of Vietnam vets, for example?
Okay, I mean, basically what abreaction is, it's reliving traumatic events, and it's reliving it in probably a much less fragmented way than getting a little piece of, let's say, getting a visual flashback. Excuse me. What an abreaction can involve, I mean, it can involve many of the senses. It can involve, it often involves, in fact, I would say it always involves very strong emotional responses as well. It can also involve body sensation, so that the person can be feeling the pressure on their chest, or can be feeling the electric current of, let's say they've been electroshocked, going through their bodies. Those are very powerful kinds of ways of remembering. They're basically a reliving of the experience. And so that it means that there's some way that it can be much more whole than just sort of getting a piece of a memory here and a piece of a memory there. Maybe getting a smell here and getting just one image, almost as if it's a photographic image. Often people will get images of something that they may have focused on when something traumatic was happening. Something that a lot of survivors have done is when there's been something unbearable happening, they focus on a picture on the wall, or a crack somewhere in the floor, or a crack in the ceiling. And that might be an image that's always been with them, but they don't know what the significance of it is. But in an abreaction, what would happen is they might be very aware, they might be looking at that crack in the abreaction, but what they're experiencing is what's happening to their bodies, and what's really what they're feeling inside themselves, all the emotional, the powerful emotional experience.
So is the process of abreaction just accessing a certain identity or part of yourself that does remember a more complete of what actually happened during the trauma, or is it the process of creating that co-cognition between the core self and those dissociated parts?
Well, I think it can be either, and it depends what part of the self actually experienced the original trauma. If the original trauma was experienced by a number of different identities, then the co-cognition would be necessary in order to have a full abreaction, the co-cognition of all of those identities that were there in the original experience. If the original experience was basically was experienced by one identity, then there isn't any co-cognition that's necessary.
I see. But in terms of bringing that into, say, that experience happened within the one identity, does the abreaction somehow allow the person to be able to understand what happened in terms of being able to explicitly explain it after the abreaction? Is there some kind of recognition in the person that what caused the trauma?
Often, yes. I mean, if somebody, it's amazing to witness abreactions, because if somebody's going through, let's say, abreacting an oral rape as a witness in the room, it's pretty definite that that's what's going on. Now, I never suggest that or never ask a leading question. My question is always open-ended, something like, can you tell me about what you just went through? But it's very frequently, if not almost always, that I had a pretty good guess as to what was happening to that person when they were going through the abreaction. And when they then report what their experience was, it's usually very much what I guessed that it was from what their body was doing during that abreaction. Mm-hmm. So, they may come out of the abreaction and say, well, what I was going through is I was being orally raped. But they may not know who did it at that point. Right. And they may then explicitly start to try to guess, or they may wait for other kinds of abreactions and flashbacks and other aspects of memory to get clues as to who it was, or they may never know who it was.
Now, you mentioned about body memories as being one of the types of implicit types of memory, and have you, in some of the people I've interviewed, they've talked about the actual body physically having, for example, reappearing burn marks or marks right on the body that relate to a memory that or an experience that happened in the past. Have you come across that?
Yes, I have. Mm-hmm. And it's almost, there's some research going on in this area, and people are postulating that there's such a thing as cellular memory, which is very interesting to think about. But we don't know exactly what's going on here. But certainly, it's this idea or this experience of having, let's say, a burn mark reappear. It does happen. I've witnessed that happening, and it's quite profound. Somebody walks in the room and they don't have that mark on them, and then they go through an abreaction, or they start to get a memory. They may not even be an abreaction, and suddenly a mark appears. And then maybe that's the beginning of an abreaction, or it may take weeks or months to get the memory that goes along with that. I think that it's my interpretation anyway is that it's part of that same experience of how memory is encoded in many different ways, and it seems to be encoded in some way in our bodies, so that when we have an abreaction of something that happened 20 or 30 or 40 or more years back, that our bodies can re-experience it in an abreaction as if it's happening right there in the moment, so that somebody can think that they can't breathe because, let's say, that part of what happened was that they were smothered, or somebody feels a pressure on their chest, or feels or is choking, or the way the body is going during an abreaction is something that somebody probably could not try to do sort of consciously, make themselves do. It's a very different kind of phenomenon from when somebody just sort of acts it out.
That's just amazing to think. And just in terms of your example of feeling, for somebody that's experienced electroshock, for example, and to re-experience the feelings of the electricity again. So that may be not just a memory in their brain, that may be actually something going on in their nervous system that they can actually feel that electricity again, or their cells or their body is experiencing that reaction again.
That's that right. And let's say, our reactions, our emotions, there's a chemical change. There's a neurochemical change. Different neurotransmitters are activated, when we're burned. And it may be, it would be very interesting to look at this, that if somebody's going through an abreaction, or that they're having a body memory, or let's say a burn mark reappear, that it would be very interesting to look at biochemically what's happening inside that person's body to see if the same kind of neurotransmitters are being stimulated and activated, and that their levels are being elevated during something like that.
Mm-hmm. So for somebody that has had repeated experiences of abuse and are dissociative, what is the healing process, or what is the process of healing in terms of your understanding?
I think that one of the important things that has to happen is that the person has to overcome the fragmentation. That if there isn't co-consciousness, and if there isn't, if the emotions aren't related, for instance, to that visual flashback, that the whole of that memory hasn't been processed, and there's still a block. It's almost like a neurological block that operates like a scratch in a record, and just seems to make that experience repeat and repeat and repeat in some sort of form, that fragmented experience. So what has to happen in the healing process is that the person needs to overcome the fragmentation, so to bring the implicit memory together with explicit, to process verbally, so that the experience is not just traumatic experience locked in implicit memory, but so that there's a processing and an understanding. I think there needs to be some serious cognitive work done too, to look at how did that trauma affect the person's belief system. What patterns have developed that have caused that person to act in certain ways? What kinds of interferences are there in relationships? So there need to be some real working on understanding the effect of the trauma in their lives, throughout their lives, and also in looking at, okay, how do I then move forward and change this in my life now? So it's a process that I think what we're realizing now can be done in a lot of different ways. I mean, there are a lot of new therapies that are coming out that different people have had different kinds of success with. So, for instance, something like EMDR, which is eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, where somebody looks at, basically they move their eyes back and forth. There are many ways to do it, but that's one way to do it. They move their eyes back and forth, similar to how somebody's eyes move in rapid eye movement sleep. And for some reason, and there are theories about why this works, it really seems to start to open up memories. It can also help the person reprocess beliefs that they have in relation to those memories. And it seems to overcome certain kind of dissociative barriers. It's something that you have to be it's kind of therapy you have to be very careful with, because it's very, very powerful. There are other kinds of therapies, like thought field therapy, that are based on the energy, like the meridians that Chinese medicine acknowledges in our bodies, and that manipulates the fields in relation to people's histories. But I think that we don't know completely how the healing needs to take place. We know we have certain techniques, we have certain things that we have varying kinds of success rates with, but I think that there are approaches that we know, if they're used in conjunction with other approaches, can be very successful. For instance, too much abreaction can mean that somebody gets overwhelmed and has trouble functioning in their lives. But a certain amount of abreaction can be very powerful, also paired with other kinds of therapy, to looking at cognitive therapy, for instance, psychodynamic therapy, different kinds of ways of really processing what happened to the person and what's the meaning of it, and ego state therapy is very important to try to get the various identities to know each other. There's a kind of group therapy that you have to do in ego state therapy, basically, so that the identities who are in conflict can learn how to navigate the world together and can build alliances with each other so that they're operating in the world in harmony, not in terrible adversity.
Mm-hmm. Do you feel that different people have to have different ways of healing, and do you feel that's related to the way people process information in terms of like either visually or orally or kinesthetically?
Very much so.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, what I find both fascinating and wonderful and challenging as a psychotherapist is that each person's process is very individual. And I can draw from my knowledge, and I can draw from various modalities, but that really the individual, herself or himself, is going to have specific needs and specific knowledge about what she or he needs to do in the process.
Now, I'd like to talk about how you understand mind control, and I guess versus more innocuous forms of social influence.
Okay, well, again, it's not, for me, it's not a versus, it's a continuum again.
Okay.
So let's go back to Pavlov and his dogs. that Pavlov played a metronome before he fed his dogs food, and fed a dog food. And what would happen is that eventually, after doing this a number of times, the dog would start to salivate any time he heard the metronome. And to the point where even when he didn't get food, if he heard the metronome, he would start salivating. And what's happening here is there's an association that the dog is making between the metronome and getting food. And then it becomes a physiological mechanism that's triggered off so that the dog starts to salivate. Well, learning is all based on this. The way, not only learning, but socialization is all based on this. So, for instance, if a child, every time he or she gets angry, is told that she's misbehaving because she's angry, and let's say that she's punished or maybe even abused when she gets angry, what she's going to start learning is that her anger and what she's starting to express or how she's starting to behave is not all right, and that maybe then fear comes in because maybe she's abused horribly when she gets angry. So she may learn then to dissociate away from the anger. And what's really happening is a phenomenon that's exactly the same as Pavlov's dog salivating. And that learning, I mean, when somebody learns, again, there are associations that are made, and that if they read, let's say they're learning to read, that when they learn words, they get rewarded for those words, so that they may be motivated to read. Or let's say somebody has some sort of learning disability, that they try to read, but they get very frustrated, and that then the association that's made is that I try to read, and I'm very frustrated. Okay, so these are just regular processes that everyone goes through, and we learn certain things by our experiences when they occur.
Now, in terms of the healing process of what has to happen in order to break that conditioning in either examples of using dissociation for that conditioning or not, how does a person break that control?
Okay, well, there are a number of factors. There are the short-term factors and the long-term. So in the long term, what has to happen is the dissociative barriers have to come down, And in some way the person has to both recognize how this programming has happened, how this conditioning has happened, what they're supposed to do, and why they believe that they're supposed to do those things, and what the emotions are often. The primary emotion, even though it may be very masked, will be terror if they don't do what they're told to do, or what they're conditioned to do, what they're programmed to do. So in breaking down the dissociative barriers, if there's, let's say that this particular identity believes that they love the perpetrator, and that they would never think of not doing what the perpetrator said. And let's say the perpetrator is telling them to do absolutely horrific things. That part of what needs to happen is that they need to start, they need to go back to how that relationship formed with that perpetrator. And they need to go back to what beliefs they had, and what, in other words, they need to get the whole experience to understand both what they're believing and why they're acting in the way that they are, and to integrate that with the emotions that are probably dissociated away and may in fact be in another identity. So often what has to happen in programming is that various identities have to be sharing information and have to somehow find a way to build those alliances so that there isn't the control over separate identities, but they form an alliance against the people who have done the mind control. So that's just one aspect. I mean, it can be very complicated and multi-layered.
So what is your approach to undoing that kind of conditioning and programming in terms of therapeutic approaches?
Well, I mean, there are many of them. I think that, there are many stages to the therapy. It can be very difficult to predetermine exactly what that road is going to be, because different people's programming happens in different ways. So part of what is really important to do is to be understanding what the structure of the identities is, and what kind of co-consciousness is there in the system, what kind of programming is there, how do the layers of programming work, and how do the layers of identities work, because there are layers of memory, there are layers of identities, and it can get very, very complex. But there are techniques that can start to expedite some of this. But what makes it very complicated in working with survivors of purposeful mind control is that often part of the programming is that if the person starts to tell, starts to remember, starts to undo the programming, there are other programs in there that can be triggered off where they might make an attempted suicide attempt, or make a suicide attempt, or they might, even if they weren't returning, let's say that there's a cult that they're supposed to return to and they've been able to resist returning, that they then can't resist anymore, they end up going back to that group that's been abusing them.
I've also heard of reporting alters, of just simply
Absolutely.
reporting back what happens.
Absolutely. Reporting identities and compliant identities. The reporting identities are usually very compliant. So that even if a person relocates to get away from a group that's doing this, that it can be very difficult because they have identities inside who will call the group and tell them exactly where they are. So part of the strategy has to be to work with those and get them allied with therapy and compliant, because they can also, that's another technique actually, is that you work with the programming that's there for the perpetrator, and you try to use it therapeutically. You try to turn it around. So, for instance, a reporting identity will not only report to, let's say, a cult, but they'll also report to the therapist. Let's say that there's some sort of scrambling programming that that means that the person's sitting there and that they can't hear clearly what somebody is saying in therapy. That scrambling kind of programming can be very useful when there's something overwhelming that takes over. That it can be useful to use the scrambling programming to scramble it so that it's not an overwhelming, let's say, abreaction or flashback or emotional state. So there are many ways to do it, and it's very complex, and it's very dependent on that particular survivor's history and the kind of mind control that's happened.
Now, I'd like to change the topic a little bit. I want to talk about how in terms of the Canadian legal system, how they have handled cases involving allegations of mind control or sadistic abuse.
Okay. Now I'm talking from a therapist's point of view, and just what I've had some sort of knowledge of is that I think that there's a lot of disbelief that these things happen in our society, and that the legal system, the criminal justice system, if a prosecutor is going to go ahead, let's say it's a criminal charge against somebody, the Crown Attorney is going to try to win the case. I mean, they don't prosecute unless they think that they can win the case. And that because the media is so full of information, this discredits the existence of this kind of abuse. And who's reading these papers, but people who are on juries, judges, that usually what happens is that part of the evidence is either left out or minimized, or the Crown Attorney talks about, well, not all of this you don't have to believe this in order to prosecute on sexual abuse. So, I mean, we do have a problem because there is a kind of conservative atmosphere in the criminal justice system. It's probably going to be the last to change, and that, it's 25 years ago, it was much more difficult to prosecute on an incest charge, and there's still psychiatric textbooks in use that say that incest occurs in 1 in a million families. Our beliefs about abuse have been totally out of line, and I think that the next 25 years, as more and more information is released from bodies like the CIA in the States, that document the kind of mind control and mind control experimentation that's been going on, we start getting much more validation. More and more survivors of mind control start speaking out, start going into the legal system, start basically getting together and sharing experiences and forming advocacy groups. I think that the personal is political, that old feminist cliche, that this is what I think will eventually and is. I think there is really a movement that will allow for more and more a gradual kind of credibility, but we have a long way to go, especially with organizations like the False Memory, I refuse to call it Syndrome, Foundation.
Call it Syndrome.
Yeah.
And what kind of I mean, the media has certainly played a large part in the public attitude in contributing to that, and I'll say it's disinformation, or they've done it in terms of my opinion, a real irresponsible or unthorough job of looking into these issues. Mm-hmm. What is your opinion of how the mainstream media has done in terms of covering issues about mind control and ritual abuse?
Okay, well, we have some basic problems because dissociation is very, very complicated. it's not something that somebody's going to understand in a 5-minute soundbite, or in a soundbite, and let alone 5 minutes, that dissociation, traumatic memory, all of those kinds of that kind of contextual information that lends credibility, provides the context for things that when somebody first meets them may sound very sensational, but if they're taken out of context, it may be very hard for somebody to understand and believe. And if there is then that media bias against the existence of these forms of abuse, mind control, various kinds of sadistic abuse, cult abuse, etc., that what starts to happen is that there's a kind of public brainwashing that's going on. And there's a mass dissociation away from the existence of these really terrible crimes that if people start to believe in them, they start to feel a lot less safe living in our society. They start to feel a lot less comfortable about sending their children off to school or off to a birthday party when they realize that these kinds of things happen in those kinds of places.
I think that the public guilt has got a part to play in that, and then if they do recognize and start to believe that these kind of things going on, I mean, it just begs public action, and people may be at a loss of what to do about it as well.
Well, I think definitely you're making an important point, is that if people do believe, then they have to act. And you're right, people don't know exactly what to do. But I think that, the survivor movement can lend some real direction here, because I think, there are a lot of very strong survivors out there advocating, informing, forming organizations that are doing some really good work, and that it has to become, I mean, in a way, there's a great metaphor here, just the way that the dissociative barriers inside someone who's been traumatized have to come down. Those barriers have to come down between people, so that there's a group momentum that starts to, force the existence of this reality into the public mind.
Mm-hmm. And your point about just the nature of mainstream media, in that they're so geared towards very quick, soundbite-oriented information. I mean, it's taken me on this show 40 hours to go through all of this material, and it does take a fair bit of understanding and really looking at it thoroughly to understand all the issues around it in order to be able to believe that this is going on.
I think you're right. And I think also that there's something that goes on socially that I think has a lot to do with our denial about the existence of all kinds of abuse. And that's just the way that we deal with emotion. I mean, I've been talking a lot about how in the healing process what has to happen is the emotions have to be joined with, flashbacks, for instance. That's part of the dissociation. When people dissociate from their emotions, that reality can change shape. Well, I think part of what happens in our society is that there's a real emotional oppression in our culture. And what I mean by that is that when people start getting very emotional, that there are, and it goes back to childhood really, if all individuals in a particular culture are, when their children, get sad and start to cry, and they say, "Don't cry," or they start to distract them with a toy, right? The message gets across very clearly that crying is not something that child is supposed to do. Same thing with anger. And and what happens to that child is that child then dissociates from those emotions. When the child dissociates from their emotions, from, let's say, his emotions or her emotions, that what then happens is when someone comes along with those emotions, let's say we're talking about sadness. Let's say that child was never allowed to cry. So what then starts to happen is when someone else cries, that child may start to get very angry because the child doesn't have access to, let's say, his own tears, and that there's fear around the tears. And with little boys, we often will condition, you might say program, the little boy not to cry, but that it's okay maybe to get angry. And so what will then start to happen is that the tears that inside that little boy that might be there in empathy with another child or an adult crying will come out as anger. And that, or maybe what happens is that that child learns that when somebody cries, you walk away. And so what we're talking about is we're talking about horrific events that the normal response to is tremendous emotion, is anger, is rage, is fear, is terror, is, all of these emotions are normal responses to horrific events. But if a person starts gaining access to these emotions and then tries to express them or express events that bring up those emotions in someone else, what's going to happen is dissociation away from them in individual after individual. So as a culture, that there's a moving away from intense emotion. And what happens in that kind of dissociation is that there's denial that this exists. It's much easier to deny that terrible mind control, purposeful mind control happens, or that sadistic cults are abusing children in a terrible way, or that the neighbor is a pedophile. It does demand action, as you're saying, but it also means that in order to empathize, someone has to feel. But if, as a culture, people have learned or been conditioned to suppress their emotions, that what they're going to do is they're going to rationalize something that prevents those emotions from coming out. So part of that rationalization is the denial that this even exists. So it does a number of things. It allows the person to remain in homeostasis, in other words, to not get upset, because if it doesn't exist, you don't have to be upset about it. If it does exist, you not only have to be upset about it, you have to do something about it. You have to keep your children safe. So that, I think that the media really feeds into this as well. We were also talking about earlier the whole aspect of betrayal. So, for instance, in a family, and this happens over and over again, is that, let's say that one member of the family starts to recall these kinds of events of let's say, of some sort of multi-perpetrator sexual abuse, or being in a child pornography ring, and that the father and mother were part of how that child got into the pornography ring, or maybe were even part of that pornography ring. That what happens is that, let's say, actually, that it's one parent that has done this. And let's say that's the father, okay? That if then the other children in the family are in the position of being confronted with this, and let's say the same thing has happened to them and they've also dissociated the memory, that this information means that they can't maintain the same relationship with that father. It means that there's a betrayal that has to go on somewhere. Either they were betrayed by that father, or else, and that they have to change that relationship with that father, or that they then can say that that's a betrayal by the child who's telling, saying that the child is making up a story. And this is part of the way both the criminal justice system and the False Memory Foundation have manipulated things, is that it's become a wonderful legal defense to blame the therapist, because that way the adult survivor is not being blamed. And that didn't work well in the courts. Adult survivors who were in a lot of pain and who were basically talking about horrific events that had happened to them, the courts would often lean in their direction a number of years ago. it wasn't until the attorney started getting this defense of, well, okay, it wasn't really, they're not really doing this to the parent. It's that terrible therapist who's just out there to make money that's implanting these memories in order to get this person to come back and so that they can earn money, and that it's the therapist's fault, not this poor victim who's not a victim of sexual abuse, but who's a victim of the therapist.
And while we're on the topic of False Memory Foundation,
right.
they have had a tremendous impact on the field of psychotherapy. In your opinion, how do you feel that this foundation has affected the quality of therapy?
Well, in a number of ways. I think that it's certainly the existence of the False Memory Foundation and the kinds of issues that they're talking about, the kinds of court cases that they've encouraged their members to proceed with against therapists, I think have made all therapists, or haven't made all of us careful. It should make all of us very careful. In some ways, I think that's had a very positive effect, and in some ways, I think that's had a very negative, harmful effect. Let me talk about the positive first. Okay. I think that it's helped a lot of therapists be aware that it's not only not safe for them in terms of the ending up in court, but it's not good therapy to have suggestive leading questions. It's much better to ask open-ended questions like, can you tell me more? Rather than to ask a leading question like, was it your father who was doing that? That's not good therapy to do that. And it can have an influence on someone if a therapist or anyone continues to suggest something to someone who is suggestible. And they're probably about, there's a minority of the population that are suggestible, supposedly. But I think the harmful effect is that it certainly elevated the level of fear for therapists. And I think that anyone in therapy, and not just in therapy, but we all as human beings need to have experiences validated. We need to do reality checks. If I talk at one of my children's PTA meetings and I may want to do a check with somebody that was there, was that reasonable what I said? And if I do a check with a number of people that were there, what they say is going to influence how I feel about what I said. Okay, and that's really important. It's important for us. We're social beings. We need that kind of validation. So if someone's been abused, particularly if they've gone through a kind of abuse that a lot of people don't know exists, like mind control, or various kinds of sadistic abuse, they need to have some sort of validation. And this becomes a dilemma because what is being recommended in a lot of the workshops and a lot of the training that psychiatrists and psychologists and other kinds of psychotherapists go through is that basically the message that you give to the person who's recovering memory is that you have to find out for yourself what your own experience is. Now, on one level, I think that's very true. No one can tell another human being what their experience, what their truth is. But on another level, if the therapist is saying, well, I don't know whether ritual abuse really exists, what they're also saying is, in a way, what they're saying is, I don't know whether you're psychotic or not. Right. Because what's psychosis? It's a disconnection from reality. So there's some really profound implications of the directions that therapists are taking for the safety for their own safety, and that I think we really as a profession have to examine. And I think that discussion is good. I think that operating with challenges is very healthy. But I think operating out of fear can be incredibly harmful. And I think that that's what's happening with a lot of therapists. And a lot of therapists are refusing to work with clients that they know are dissociative as a result. But I think that we have to be looking at how can there be good therapy that protects everybody, but also doesn't do the client a disservice.
Mm-hmm. And that expression of disbelief in a general sense of whether ritual abuse exists or not, again, is not good therapy, from my understanding. It's that creates tremendous trauma in the client again.
Well, okay. I think this brings up another whole area, which is that people don't want to believe that these things have happened to them. So part of the whole process, a healthy kind of therapeutic process, involves self-questioning. Now, it's very important for the therapist not to come in and say, yes, this happened to you, when the survivor is still wondering, did it happen or did it not? But I think that if the therapist is saying, I don't know whether this kind of thing can exist or whether this could have happened to you, and is basically implanting doubts, that's what's happening, is that the doubts are being fed. I think it's better not to feed the doubts nor to feed the certainty. I think it's better, I think it is important to stay in some sort of position where the client is able to continue to take the information that's coming up and try to process it in an ethical way for herself or himself, but to also look at, okay, what do you need to, what kind of outside corroboration is there here? So, for instance, if there's another sibling that has similar kinds of experiences, and if the person's not planning on going to court, because you wouldn't want them to be sharing those experiences, because there'd be contamination there of evidence if they were going into the legal system, the criminal justice system. But that can be one form of corroboration if the sharing happens after both people have been in their therapeutic processes for a period of time. There can be other kinds of corroboration that, let's say they have a memory of something happening, let's say a particular, being transported in a particular kind of car. Now, this is explicit memory, and it could be wrong, but if it's right, it's very powerful. That they didn't know they had a red Ford, in 1964, but in fact they did, and that there's some way. So to start corroborating, or they didn't know that this little building was located there, and they go back and there it was, and maybe there was, as in Sybil, there were marks that were made that they remember making during a particular event. So there, those kinds of reality checks, it can be very powerful, and they may not hold in court. I mean, that's not what this process is really ultimately about. It's about the person reclaiming self, and that having that kind of external validation, I think, can be extraordinarily helpful in the process.
Do you think there might be possible pitfalls or dangers of the therapist in helping their clients get that corroborative evidence?
Well, it shouldn't be for evidence. A therapist is not a lawyer. A therapist is not, the job is not to go out and is to help the person form a legal case. Okay? The therapist's job, though, is to help the person do what he or she needs to do to heal. And I think it is very important to do reality checks. And I guess maybe reality check is a better way of talking about it. It's than sort of getting evidence. It's just it's basically looking at, okay, is this explicit way that I'm interpreting my implicit memory, does it have some accuracy to it? I think that's helpful.
Right. So you've mentioned that the False Memory Foundation. Well, I'll ask you, how do you feel that they have affected resources for survivors of sexual or ritual abuse or mind control?
I think that in terms, as I was saying a little bit before, is that in terms of access to therapy and as in terms of access to groups that are dealing with this kind of materials, in terms of funding, that the False Memory Foundation has really, really impaired access to these kinds of resources. Certainly in terms of books, in terms of discussion groups, in terms of the internet, I don't think there's an impairment at all. I think in some ways it's brought a lot of people together to try to advocate against the False Memory Foundation and what they're saying. So in that way, I think that it's helped that, it's helped groups of people get together and talk. But I do think it's also what the False Memory Foundation says can be very harmful to people who are at the beginning or in the midst of their processes. That there's this cultural denial that the False Memory Foundation is feeding, and it has an impact on a very personal level. Families use this against you. If there's been some sort of confrontation, families use it in their arguments against the survivor who's talking. And I think that that the kinds of strategies that the False Memory Foundation is encouraging are extremely intrusive and violating. And as Judith Herman said at the recent International Society for Study of Dissociation conference, it's a mouthful, that they're using the same kind of intimidation tactics, that perpetrators have used in the abuse, that there's a lot of perpetrator rage there, and that the False Memory Foundation is really harboring a lot of perpetrators. Mm-hmm. Maybe not every single person who belongs to the False Memory Foundation is a perpetrator, but there are a lot of people who do belong, who I believe have perpetrated and are using this as basically a front.
Yeah, and certainly there has been documented evidence of the members of the advisory board being involved in CIA mind control.
That's right.
And being active pedophiles and so forth. Now, and of course, one of the arguments that they're repeatedly use is that therapists have been implanting false memories in their clients. But do you feel that it's possible that people may have false memories or I'll say false memories of sexual abuse?
Well, let's go back a minute. Let's talk about false memory. Because I think a lot of people have false memories. I think most of us have some false memories. And in fact, the way false memories often go is that we tend to idealize people. We tend to idealize our families and what happened in our families. We tend to not remember uncomfortable events vividly. We might change them. We might think that we had a wonderful family when in fact we had a family that argued all the time. Or, those are the kinds of things that people tend to block out. And there's research that really backs that up, that shows that, when there's been documented abuse or abusive situations, that, and it's with a group of boys that were basically interviewed many years later, that they tended to minimize the abuse rather than remember exactly how horrific it was. So people have false memories that idealize and minimize. Okay.
So you're saying the tendency more is that way in terms of exaggerating the negative aspects of that?
It makes sense. I mean, if I've been talking about homeostasis. Yeah. We try to find the things that are going to make us feel better. So we tend to try to think that people are nicer than they are, or situations are safer than they really are, to try to bring down our anxiety levels or try to make ourselves feel better. And it makes sense. It makes a lot of sense to me. Now, in terms of false memories in therapy, I've really had to look at that and realize that of course that can happen. that, as I say, people are interpreting their experiences in these ways that are inaccurate, that can be quite inaccurate. Explicit memory, we can remember something that happened yesterday in an inaccurate way. If it doesn't, this also has to do with our adrenaline level. If an experience happens and we don't particularly pay attention to it, our adrenaline level is pretty low. We don't remember all the details. We also filter out. We have something in our brains called a reticular formation, which helps to filter out experience. Because if we weren't filtering out and we were paying attention to our tastes and the smells and the sounds and our emotions and all things at once, we would be overwhelmed all the time. Our nervous systems wouldn't be able to handle it. So filtering is a really important part of how we remember, we experience things and how we remember our experiences. So if we are in a particular circumstance one day that we're trying to recall the next day, and our adrenaline level wasn't particularly high because it wasn't a particularly significant moment in our lives, we may not remember things very accurately. If it's much more significant to us, our adrenaline level will be higher. This is a theory, and that the adrenaline level really affects how we remember things. That if then something was really emotionally significant to us, and we may remember certain aspects of things, while someone else that was involved in that same experience may remember totally different aspects. Other things may have been significant to that other person. So we may remember, let's say that we have visual things were very important to, let's say, to me. And let's say that the other person was really tuned into the sounds. And let's say I'm asked a question about the sounds. I may be really inaccurate about the sounds, and I may guess at things to try to answer the question for the other person. And let's say the other person was asked about visual, and the same thing may be happening for him or her. And so they may be very accurate on the sounds and very inaccurate on the visual. And so what happens is that there are aspects then of each person's experience that might be more accurate and less accurate about a particular event. Okay, let's take this into therapy. That we do tend, I think the research is very clear that we do tend to fill in gaps. We do tend to try to explain things that are making us uncomfortable and that we might not have an explanation for. And good therapy will help the person to remain in uncertainty in those areas where there is uncertainty. And to encourage a person not to do that, that very natural process, not to exaggerate it, not to, that if it becomes very clear what are the major areas of concentration for somebody, whether somebody is a visual person or an auditory person or an olfactory person, what are the senses that are most important for that person? How do they remember experience? How do they live their lives? And so that what I think is very distressing to people, but they need to learn to do in this whole process, is if they have a fragment of a memory here and another one there and another one there, is not to force them all together in a way that they don't fit. And it's a very complex, difficult, layered process, and it's very important, though, when things do fit, to look at the correlations, but to also look at this may or may not be the way that it was.
So how does a group like the False Memory Syndrome Foundation use the nature of inaccurate memories? And
okay, well,
how do they use that against survivors that have had legitimate histories of sexual abuse?
Okay, well, I think what they do, it's not just using inaccurate memories, but what they do is they take research about one kind of memory and they apply it to traumatic memory. So they take research about ordinary, everyday, explicit memory, and they apply it. They act as if all memory operates in the same way that ordinary, everyday memory would operate. So they really, I mean, now they're being a bit less extreme. They're acknowledging that dissociation does occur. But and it's not just one person. There are different people speaking out for the organization, so different people have different takes. I mean, the whole argument about, is there such a thing as repressed memory? One of the people that is very active in the False Memory Foundation, and whose research has been used and I think misused by the False Memory Foundation, is Elizabeth Loftus. Now, her studies are not done on traumatized people, and she has argued against the existence of repressed memory. And yet, in a study she did with a number of other colleagues, even though it was maybe a smaller sample that had repressed memory, there was a sample, I believe it was something like 19% of people that had repressed memory, even in Elizabeth Loftus's study. So I think that it's harder and harder, and as the research accumulates, to deny the existence of dissociation.
Well, I'd like to thank you very much, Gail, for joining us. It's been fascinating talking to you.
Well, thank you, Wayne.
That was an interview with Gail Fisher-Taylor, sharing her views and insights into the effects of trauma, ritual abuse, and mind control. Gail is a psychotherapist working in Toronto with trauma survivors. Next, we're going to hear an interview with Dr. Connie Christensen, professor of psychology at Carleton University in Ottawa. Dr. Christensen specializes in recovered memory research and sexual abuse issues. I'm talking with Dr. Connie Christensen, who is a professor at Carleton University. And I guess I'd like to begin about asking you what is your background and what things you are working on with regards to child abuse.
I'm trained as a social psychologist, and I've been applying this background to, first of all, understand the social psychological factors underlying people's opinions in the recovered memory debate. And then I've also been examining the nature of women's recovered memories of child abuse and contrasting those memories, for example, with the characteristics of the memories of women who never forgot about their abuse. So I've done some research with adult women who have, in fact, survived child sexual abuse. So generally, I've been doing social psychological analyses of the recovered memory debate and trying to gain more insight into the nature of recovered memories.
I understand you were attending the Making Up for Lost Time conference in Thunder Bay. This was back in '94, I guess. What did you come away with that might have been new information to you, or what were there any expectations going into the conference? Or
I guess the one thing that I came away with was a greater appreciation for people's concern with ritual abuse and the mind control experiments that have been done. And in my mind, from my perspective, I have difficulty believing some of the stories that I heard. So I'm a little bit skeptical. However, on the other hand, I know that people don't believe all sorts of things that can indeed be true. So I'm trying to stay open-minded in regard to the more extreme forms of abuse that people are speaking about.
With your experiences, how prevalent do you think child abuse is in our society? And maybe you could talk about how many from people that have been abused as children, how many do suffer memory repression or memory loss or dissociation?
My understanding, or my estimate that I would make of the incidence of child abuse would be about 1 in 3 women being sexually abused prior to age 18, and maybe 1 in 5 to 1 in 6 men. And I'm basing these estimates on the findings of a couple of large epidemiological studies done both in Canada and in the States. My review of the literature to date, as well as the findings from the Ottawa Survivor Study that we conducted here out of Carleton, indicate that roughly between 40 and 60% of all women who are sexually abused will report at least some memory loss for the child abuse events. So in the Ottawa Survivor Study, for example, about 50% of the sample of 113 women said that they had at least some memory loss.
And can you talk about how that mechanism, for lack of a better term, works with somebody that has undergone some kind of trauma and experienced some kind of memory loss? Like, what is going on in the human brain and body?
There have been a couple of processes that have been talked about to account for this memory loss. One is repression, which I think is what most people think of. And the evidence for repression, whereby a person sort of unconsciously, unknowingly keeps a lid on something traumatic that they don't want to know about, the evidence for that kind of unconscious process in repression is actually quite weak. But there is strong evidence that people will actively try to suppress information. And in fact, Freud himself sometimes spoke of repression as an active rather than an unconscious process. So if you look at repression as an active phenomenon whereby a person tries to forget a traumatic event and also manages to forget, trying to forget, then there is some evidence for repression. But probably what most researchers are looking at to explain the memory loss of child sexual abuse is the notion of dissociation. And dissociation is a type of altered state of consciousness that occurs as a result of trauma. And what happens during trauma is that there are various neurochemical changes that occur in the form of what you might call a traumatic stress response. And these neurochemical changes are known to change and adversely affect our conscious memory processes. It changes the neurochemicals that have been found to be associated with conscious memory processes. These neurochemicals also affect various brain structures physically that are responsible for conscious memory processes. So ultimately what seems to happen is that during trauma, the neurochemicals overwhelm our normal memory system. And as a result, people cannot remember traumatic abuse in the way we normally remember daily events. Rather, what does get stored at the time of trauma is a non-conscious type of memory, which operates in a different part of the brain, which isn't made dysfunctional by the trauma. So the memories are laid down in this alternative memory system, and the memories there are raw, perceptual, sensory, bodily sensations and emotions. They're not your sort of conscious memories where I went to the store and then I did this and then I did that. You might remember, for example, if when you went to the store, you might remember the fumes of a diesel bus that had just gone by, but you would remember those fumes out of context and with no sort of cognitive framework to embed it in. And so that's how we think that memory is laid down at the time of trauma, is in this bodily and sensory form. And that's actually what we see survivors telling us when they recover their memories. They don't come back the normal way that we talk about memory. What they'll do is they'll come sort of willy-nilly out of the blue, and the person will feel like they're literally reliving some part of that event. So they may have a smell, an image, a sensation, or an emotional experience that comes back, and it doesn't make sense in the current day context. But what it is these fragments of sensory and emotional memory that are sort of flashing back into the present.
Now, of course, the debate around recovered memory is being hotly debated in North America. And there are some groups out there that have been very active in pursuing lawsuits against therapists and survivors that are coming forward. I'm thinking particularly of the False Memory Syndrome Foundation. What has your experiences been with that group?
I know that some of my academic colleagues who would advocate in favor of the idea of false memory syndrome have tried to bring me up on ethical charges. And I hear that that's something common by FMS advocates trying to get the researchers on ethics. So far they haven't been successful. And other experiences that I've had with them, well, they'll write to me sometimes. And with little bits of information, sarcastic humor, nothing too nasty.
Has it? Are you aware of other therapists being intimidated by this group, or?
Oh well, you take Laura Brown, who's an active psychologist who worked on the review of the recovered memory issue with the American Psychological Association. Laura Brown's office has been picketed on a regular basis, and she's perpetually harassed. So I know there's a lot of harassment going on out there, especially in the States. Here in Canada, I think we're a little more mellow. Mm-hmm. Give us 10 years, maybe we'll be on par.
How do you think this environment has changed the resources available for people that may suspect they have been victims of child abuse?
I gather that it hasn't been beneficial. Well, it's sort of it's a knife that cuts both ways, actually. In one sense, the publicity given to child abuse has made a lot of therapists and people who acknowledge the validity of the research findings on which the information is based. People who are learning about child abuse are now taking it more seriously, so maybe there's better treatment, better resources to some extent. One good consequence of the recovered memory controversy is that I think more money is being funded into research for both sides of the camp, those who support recovered memories and those who believe they're false. So, of course, we're going to learn more about traumatic memory one way or another, and that can't be bad. And ultimately, hopefully, it would help survivors. On the other hand, I think that it's had a really bad impact on survivors in several ways. One is you hear things about the Criminal Compensation Board being suspect of any claims based on recovered memories. So survivors are having a rougher time getting some financial compensation based on this debate, because of this debate. Other consequences, well, in the Ottawa Survivor Study, we also assessed how the debate was affecting these women, and not surprisingly, these women said that this debate was having an adverse effect on all the areas of their lives that had been previously affected by the trauma. So in other words, this debate is re-victimizing some of the survivors and making them experience more of those symptoms again. So it's having a detrimental effect. On the other hand, a small minority of this sample said it's made them mad as hell and they're getting out there to do something about it. So I can see that it's activated some women in a really positive way.
And what you mentioned the FMSF using other people to attack therapists on grounds of ethics. What other kind of arguments are they using? And are there indeed other organizations like FMSF that exist out there that have been actively kind of intimidating people?
I don't know about any other organizations, but what they're saying is that some therapists are doing what they call voodoo therapy. In fact, the FMSers have called me a voodoo scientist. And so what they're claiming is that some therapist techniques are actually causing the creation of false memories. In the cases where they are picketing and so on, I'm pretty convinced that this isn't going on. A lot of psychologists know what they're doing. They're doing good work with their clients. They're not suggesting things to their clients. And I think some of the better work is probably being done by the feminists, because they have a sort of non-authoritarian style. So they're not inclined to tell clients what they think happened or what caused their state of beingness at this point. Whereas more traditional psychiatric approaches tend to have an idea of what the person is like before they've even met the person. More judgmental, and they impose, the clinician imposes their own reality on the client. So I think the feminists have a good approach in terms of working with recovered memories, simply because they try to empower the client to take better care of themselves, rather than the therapist looking after the client and telling her what her reality is.
What kind of approaches do therapists take with clients in order to avoid being accused of implanting memories? And has this changed because of the rise of the FMSF?
Well, I know some therapists who've actually refused to take on clients who might take their alleged perpetrators to court on the basis of recovered memories. I know there are other therapists who've stopped treating survivors altogether. Then there are other therapists who are, being especially careful to monitor their behavior, to make sure they're not suggestive, particularly when any abuse stuff comes up. So people are using different approaches, I think, depending on how confident they feel in themselves. And I don't mean in terms of their own ability, but how they could deal with a potential lawsuit and whether they really want to face that possibility.
So do people kind of have ways of documenting, like taping the sessions or things like that?
Yeah, I think a lot of therapists are learning now that if they're going to use techniques like hypnosis, they should ideally have an audiovisual tape of the session, because in that way there's clear evidence exactly how suggestive was the process. And so that's highly recommended, is to tape everything when it comes to be about sort of abuse issues.
Now, some of the arguments in this debate are, like children just making up stories just to get back at their parents for some, whatever reason. How difficult is it, do you think, to tell whether somebody is actually, just making up a story, or that there is real signs of abuse there?
I imagine it would probably be pretty difficult. One of the things that we did in the Ottawa Survivor Study was look to see if we could identify anybody who has this nosologically unrecognized entity called false memory syndrome. And so what we did was we developed a list of the symptoms of false memory syndrome based on the writings of the FMS Foundation and their advisory board members. And we went out and documented how many women with recovered memories satisfied these criteria. And the rate was very, very low. Like a few percent of the women with recovered memories could potentially be classified as having false memory syndrome. The rate was just as high, though, with the women who had never forgotten their abuse and who had continuous memories. So those criteria don't seem to differentiate continuous from recovered memories. And moreover, some of the criteria are just downright silly. One of them is that you should suspect a claim of abuse if it is denied by the alleged perpetrator. Well, I would expect that many perpetrators would deny abuse that had actually occurred. So I'm not surprised that the criteria didn't differentiate. Another criteria is that the children were blissfully happy as young children and teenagers, and they were doing very well in life until they met the therapist who implanted the memory. Well, when we looked at the data, we found that the women with recovered memories reported as much symptomology in childhood and in their teen years as the women with continuous memories reported. So their symptom levels are basically the same, which goes contrary to what the FMS Foundation is claiming.
Well, thank you very much, Connie, for joining us on CKLN. I wish you all the best in your work.
Okay, thank you.
You've been listening to an interview with Dr. Connie Christensen, Professor of Psychology at Carleton University, and previous to that, an interview with Gail Fisher-Taylor. That concludes the interviews for this radio series. We're going to wrap it all up with 2 panel discussions the next 2 weeks. First, a panel on ritual abuse and survivor healing with Toronto-based therapists Elise Murphy and Gail Fisher-Taylor, and survivor and advocate Karen Stardancer, publisher of Survivorship. Then on Sunday, March the 1st, a panel discussion on mind control, government military mind control, with Walter Board, author of Operation Mind Control, and Don Gilmore, author of I Swear by Apollo. So have your questions ready, because we'll be opening the phone lines so you can voice your concerns with these issues the next 2 weeks. Tapes and transcripts of this entire radio series are available at the office of CKLN at 380 Victoria, Jorgensen Hall at Ryerson University. You've been listening to 88.1, and coming up next is A Key Nuestra America.